Howdy, all of you delicious people. I am here today to review Batman Forever. Did you know when it snows, my eyes become large and the light that you shine can be seen? Baby! Yeah, we are here today to review this movie. Reasonably, the only reason why I'm really going out of my way to finally say that I'm reviewing this film is because ultimately, this is the only Batman movie that I'm aware of that has Halloween in it. So ultimately, when looking at this film, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to go into this film because ultimately it has Halloween. And ultimately, when looking at it, via this being currently into the second it's recording, an October-ish like moment, yeah, like it's been a very long time since watching this movie, and now when watching this movie, I can completely understand exactly why it's been so long since the last time I've watched it. We have so many actors and or actresses that are very much overpowering within this movie. Everybody is trying to really just knock it out of the park within these performances. And reasonably, I think probably the best performances for me, honestly, were probably Nicole Kidman because she is probably the most interesting character that I enjoyed. And then ultimately, I really like Chris O'Donnell because ultimately, knowing full well, like this movie, if anything, kind of catapulted him to keep getting work full well after the numerous times that he had very much just kind of done some flops even shortly thereafter, aka Batman and Robin, and aka a number of other things until eventually he found one show with LL Cool J that seemed to be consistently going well for quite a span of time. So ultimately, going into this movie, we have it to where I have some knowledge about this Batman-ish like movie. Knowing full well how much knowledge I know about kind of Batman-ish like things, I have a little bit of behind-the-scenes knowledge about this movie, and like I didn't get it from like a commentary section of this movie. So ultimately, we were actually supposed to have within this movie there being Michael Keaton within this film. Ultimately, Michael Keaton was actually getting fitted to be suited up for this film yet again, and ultimately, Michael Keaton had come to ultimately know about this film being done, and ultimately he was getting fitted to, of course, get his suit because ultimately knowing full well how very difficult these suits are, he Keaton had heard that Michael or Keaton had Keaton had heard that Michael Keaton had heard that Tim Burton had pulled out of directing this movie. So easily and quickly, Keaton had basically mentioned it's like, well, if Burton's out, I'm out. So reasonably, that had them scramble to start to find yet another Batman. And ultimately, what had happened is we were actually supposed to get a very much more younger Batman. Ultimately, through the casting of this movie, they were actually supposed to get like a Batman kind of like the age of Christian Bale-ish and much younger Batman. And so when they were going and thinking about casting this actor, ultimately they otherwise decided to say to this person, you know what, we would love it for you to be Batman, but the only problem is that we have decided to go another direction. because ultimately the studio has to have three Val Kilmer movies this within Kilmer's contract. So this movie is forcibly going to have to be it. And ultimately, this person was maybe jockeying through a secondary position of Robin, but ultimately, again, this guy who was going to ultimately be Batman was too in shape, like too ridiculously in shape to not only like he should have been Batman, but then all the while he was too in ridiculously in shape that he would have outshined Batman. So ultimately, yeah, that guy didn't work out, but I guess Kilmer, because of studio obligations, was in this movie. So it's kind of interesting to see that ultimately I could understand now exactly why Kilmer was casted to be in this film because he just forcibly had to. So more than likely, Kilmer probably didn't want to play Batman, probably didn't like this film, but ultimately probably realized that he was going to get a big fat check out of this whole thing. So I don't know how Keaton or Kilmer felt about this project. It would be interesting to see ultimately how ultimately he would talk about it and just be like, yeah, I was just kind of obligated to do this movie. I hated the script, or I didn't like the people I was playing adjacent of. But I don't know. I kind of just went into this and just kind of like, okay, let's try to do this. It seems like within this movie, it seems that we have seemingly really very few action like sequences. It doesn't seem like there is enough action going on in this movie, and when looking at it, I'm like, man, there is just a lot of story going on here. It seems bizarre to me to ultimately have a lot of focus being done on Kilmer trying to, let's just say, get the girl in this movie. And it also seems like a lot of villain character building, which ultimately. Here's the thing. So we have count them, two villains in this movie, and really neither one of them take any lick of time to really give a real true origin-esque like story in this movie. It kind of feels like the origin part of these two characters were like very phoned in, and then on top of that, their villain stories were like a boatload of I could not really care about. When going into this movie, it would be very interesting to see the rough drafts of these films, or to see the rough draft of this film, to ultimately see like what the differences were of how eventually they got to these points to realize, hey, let's do this. Like, I wonder if basically the rough draft of the script probably was the actual just script they went with and just jumped on. Um, Ultimately, knowing full well, there was a lot of time of just taking up, really telling too much of a lot of stories. It was like, okay, we gotta tell barely how Two Face became a thing, and Two Face has much more of the action side, and then we'll have a build of Riddler, and Riddler will have his very much consistent story of him kind of being this insane wacko that ultimately is just not going to take it anymore. And then, hey, we eventually have to get to Robin's story and ultimately have him be this very much person that is is not going to have anybody wait for him and this and that and wait on him and whatever. And like there is so much stuff that is not really focused enough on the person that is really, I think, sharing the title. Because I think really when Bruce goes with scenes with his love interest in this movie, Nicole Kidman's character, basically she seemingly like outshines him every single time. Like she very much is much more interesting to watch and look at than Kilmer's character is. Basically, we have rendered Val Kilmer and or Batman to be a person that isn't selling this movie at all. Like everything is much more interesting than Batman himself, and Batman is slapped onto the title. It's not Batman and Robin this time, it's Batman Forever. Um, when going into this movie, the main complaint that I have is the color palette in this movie is far too in your face, as well as the actors' performances are far too well in your face. Ultimately, when going into this, there is just some like and this movie is trying to desperately also be like a transitional movie, trying to like change the guard of ultimately going like, hey, yeah, like we're still trying to be in that Michael Keaton Ash like bubble, which it's only that way just because of Batman's costume design, but then ultimately have to transition into, hey, but this is going to be the new Batman, and so they have to forcibly do that, and then that like transitions us into like the new wave of Batman, which is not something I care about, to be brutally honest, within this film. So with with this movie, I ultimately will probably just say let's go out of our way to now spoil this film. Reasonably, yeah, it's just a movie that really does not hold up. If anything, I would probably much rather skip to Batman and Robin. There's there's so much about this movie that feels very like this feels like this movie feels like Batman the TV show as far as set pieces, as far as just overall like approach of this movie. It seems very sitcom-ish, like all the jokes, like of course chicks dig the car and like all of these lines that they're throwing in there to like I think to try to like very much commercialize this movie more, jazz it up to otherwise try to get some kind of commercial beats, or otherwise have this movie just be much more of an engine that is trying to go out of its way to be different than previous two films. And ultimately we have Batman smiling in this movie, which makes donut holes worth of no sense. And just everything about this movie is just, especially like Val Kilmer's Ash like dream sequences that go nowhere. It's just kind of eventually to lead us to eventually have his dreams go to the right woman to ultimately get her to pity him, and that's about all that really burns into my mind of why that Kilmer is having these dream sequences in this movie, because this dream sequence that he keeps popping into his mind is just, to me, just like, okay, what was the point of going into all that? I just don't quite. Are we basically saying that Batman in this movie is a nut job? Because I guess that would make sense. Because ultimately, we have it to where Batman has bats on the brain. So, going into this movie, we also have to kind of recycle and or reuse to ultimately just say that, like, at first we were truly supposed to cement that the Joker originally uh, had killed uh, Martha and Thomas Wayne, but now it seems that ultimately within this movie, like, it seems that they are trying to just recycle and ultimately just say it's like, oh no, Two Face had killed Bruce Wayne's parents, but then ultimately, like, when Kilmer was talking, or when Bruce was talking, he had said at first that he's like, oh, I killed them, and then yeah, so going into this movie, we have like so many things that like just don't quite make sense to, like, why did we go through these odd like journeys that when we have Batman and Robin, they kind of like tip to the hat of doing that a little bit within the sequel, but like, thank God those Christian Bale movies came in, because like they killed all of that. They're like, no, we're not going to do these silly dream sequences that make no sense, and if anything, we're just going to have it in flashbacks, not stupid silly like, hey, we're going to have a scene going on, and this guy is going to be watching some flashback-ish like scene, like Bruce Wayne is watching TV into his own mind, which is just weird. So I guess that could be the real true metaphor for why we have also Riddler very much in this movie doing what he does. So let's go into spoilers about this movie. Let's really break down this film, because at the end of the day, this is probably the most, like, this movie is the most unserious Batman film. Everything is trying as very much more than possible to be a joke, or to be taken as there being that it's like, no, this movie is trying as much as possible to not be as dark as the previous two movies, because ultimately the people that done Batman had ultimately had a complaint at some point that Batman was too dark of a character. Isn't that the point? Isn't that really and truly the point? Um, but I think ultimately, when looking at it, like, the first two Burton films were too dark, so ultimately now that they are transitioning and have a different kind of picture, and ultimately are having a much more younger protege-ish like sidekick, here is when we have a much more shift, like the comic books did, to ultimately make Batman much more colorful, much more kid friendly, and at the end of the day, a very just all over the place kind of movie. So let's go into those spoiler times. Let's go into this movie at the end of the day. There's probably a lot of points where I'm not going to go into heavily detail about this movie. Kind of skip around a little bit, just because ultimately there's a lot of stuff going on in this movie, probably too much going on in this movie, and some points are really very irrelevant. So let's go into this movie. Realistically, of course, at the very beginning of this film, we have to where, of course, the bat signal is out. Batman is pedaling to metal to ultimately get to where ultimately Batman has to come and save the day. So we have Two Face that is very much going and trying to, of course, steal money because, of course, that's you're a criminal. What else would you do? And so ultimately, they end up taking a security guard and shoving him into a vault, and then ultimately making their way to getting onto a helicopter. And so we have to ultimately Batman arrives on scene, and so ultimately we have, of course, Batman talking to Gordon, and again, I could care less for this James Gordon in this world, in this universe. And so reasonably, we have Batman meeting Nicole Kidman, and so really, right out of the gate, she is very much smitten with Batman. Ultimately, uh, like kind of mentioning how like Batman, how bats are kind of rodents and stuff like that. So we have this kind of like tongue in cheek going on thing right here where ultimately like Nicole Kidman's character is kind of lining these lines up to kind of make fun of Batman, and Batman has a quick comeback and this and that, and so ultimately Kidman's character is ultimately going, "Oh, hey, like I have a dancing partner now." Everybody else would just kind of quickly dismiss these things or ultimately not have something to um, be smart enough to come back at me with anything. I'm intrigued with this man. So we ultimately have to where Batman goes and eventually saves the security guard that is ultimately within inside this vault. The only problem is when he ends up having the vault's door closed upon him, we ultimately find that all of these seemingly places within this vault that can carry money instead is carrying acid. So eventually, Batman has to figure out how to reopen this vault via grabbing the hearing aid from this guy to otherwise be able to uh, refigure the combination of this safe. And eventually, of course, he does. Then eventually, of course, he then is very much trying to knock off the safe and ultimately just kind of make his way to Two Face. So, recently we have it to where at first we have it to where Two Face, of course, pretty much assumes that Batman is dead, but when really looking at it, this is the very beginning of the movie. I don't think Batman is dead. So, we ultimately have a hooligan or a goon that is ultimately mentioning, hey, face, Batman. So, we have to where, of course, Two Face does the stupidest move and shoots his own front of his helicopter, which, of course, has the point of which to control said helicopter. But what even gets even much more laughable and worse after this is we have to where ultimately Batman easily breaks through this helicopter glass window like it's nothing. Like, basically, it is like the flimsiest glass that I have ever seen in my life. Like, even bashing his head through the glass makes no sense to me. And then ultimately, like, Batman is telling Two Face, it's like, come on, Harvey, give it up. Like, there's so many lines within this movie, not to mention, like, the really big hamming it up moment with between Robin and Batman, where, like, they can't just have, like, oh, hey, yeah, we're a duo now. No, they really have to have these this buildup of this partnership, which I find it just so bizarre, and to the point to where they have to, like, cement this whole partnership. It's so odd. So come on, Harvey, give it up. So we have to where ultimately Two-Face ends up going and going through the ladder of this helicopter to eventually evade Batman. Eventually, I believe he ends up on some boat or some otherwise vehicle to ultimately leave Batman to supposedly crash into a giant statue of sorts, which ultimately we of course believe. It's like, again, Batman's gonna live through this. So we have it to where we are pushing on to very much get much more Origin Ash like stories out of the way. And so now we have to tailor ourselves to eventually getting our way to Nigma, Edward Nigma. So we have to where we have Edward Nigma that is ultimately he loves Bruce Wayne. He emphatically just loves this man, and ultimately he loves working for him and this and that. And so we have to where Bruce Wayne is ultimately going through Wayne Enterprises and seemingly ultimately just looking over everybody, because why have someone actually looking over people? Why not just kind of thumb through and kind of go through some things yourself, I guess? I guess he's really checking over the day to day, but when looking at this, it's just like, why? Why should Bruce care? So we have it to where Val Kilmer or Bruce is ultimately going through checking on the day to day of realistically what his people are inventing, as if Bruce Wayne just throws money at anything and doesn't know what anyone is inventing. So let me get this straight. So Bruce Wayne knows about a therapist that is a therapist from out of town, from who knows where, and she comes here. He knows about her. He ultimately tells her that her stuff is insightful, and so ultimately he is very well versed in some bizarre stranger, but it seems that the people working under him, he doesn't know what they're working on. It just seems like he's a guy that is just throwing money at a thing that he doesn't know what's going on. Because ultimately we have Edward Nigma working on a project that ultimately Bruce Wayne has no clue of what it is about. So I just thought that was dumb. It's like, so Bruce Wayne just throws money into this business, and ultimately it seems that that nobody really knows what anybody does in this place. And so it's like people could just be sitting around making money off of who knows what until they can figure out if something works. So going into this, we have it to where Bruce is ultimately seeing over what Edward Nygma is doing, and ultimately it is talking a lot about brainwaves, and ultimately Edward is trying to tell Bruce that ultimately at some point he is going to be able to let people be able to see 3D images. And like Bruce is starting to warm up to this idea, but then he is also thinking it's like, well, if you're using this TV to transmit brainwaves, isn't that like kind of brain manipulation? And isn't that also just like what is going to happen if like someone could have a signal to pick up on these brainwaves? Like, I don't know. It seems like there's a lot to this. And so ultimately, of course, eventually we have Kilmer, who is eventually kind of in a very long stretch of progress of spending way too much time with Edward Nygma, ultimately is looking out the window. Like you would think, like Bruce Wayne, like you would think this guy would have like a crick in his neck for how many freaking times he'd probably be just like jerking his head to go and look out a window to ultimately see if the bat signal is up. And so ultimately Bruce notices there is a bat signal and he decides like, you know what, I think I gotta leave. I have an appointment. So we ultimately have it to where Edward is just like, well, like, am I gonna have funding for this project? Like, I would really like to know now. I feel I deserve it. And so ultimately, of course, Bruce ultimately says it's like, well, it seems like your project raises too many questions, and I think it's gonna have to be a no. And then ultimately, we get, of course, Edward that is like, too many questions? My project raises too many questions? So we have a tour, of course. Batman or Bruce leaves, and so ultimately that ends up having Edward's boss kind of harangue him because ultimately he, uh, like, this boss of Edward's kind of very much is seemingly a person that really hates him and is really bizarrely going out of his way to put this one guy really in his place. Because I think maybe for this guy, he probably thinks he's too smart for his own good. So ultimately, very much wanting to push him into just like, God, I just want to fire this guy. Just because he thinks he's too smart and he's not smart enough. So going into this, Batman ends up going and trying to follow up on to this bat signal. And so what ends up happening is that within this first early on of Batman fighting some goons and then ultimately having known full well that we have an entire movie where Tommy Lee Jones is just flipping a coin in this movie or shooting some gun or otherwise just kind of not really being quite that relevant within this movie, as well as seemingly a lot of people are within this film, with the exclusion of Jim Carrey, because really he has to be because he's so overly, powerfully overacting in this movie. Like, there is no ceiling for this man. So ultimately, he's again just like smacking it out of the park and trying to hit Pluto or somewhere. So within this movie, we have to where the bat signal is not for James Gordon to let Batman know, hey, crime's afoot. We have it to where instead it is, of course, again, Nicole Kidman's character letting Batman know that Two-Face's coin could be possibly his Achilles heel. And so Batman is just like, that's it? Like, that's all you got for me? It's like, I'm sorry, the bat signal is not a beeper. And so we have it to where ultimately Nicole Kidman's character is copping a feel. Ultimately, like really just like desperately wanting to be in the midst of Batman to ultimately like realize it's like it must be tough putting on all that leather, and ultimately he says try fireman, it's a lot easier to take off. So ultimately Batman in his mind of realm of trying to figure out why exactly everybody is so fascinated by Batman, it must be that chicks dig the car. And ultimately, the one thing that I forgot in the very early part of this scene, which I ultimately know full well, at some point it ends up, I think, becoming a McDonald's commercial. When Batman first leaves for the very beginning of this movie, ultimately Alfred says that he'll make something up for Bruce, and Bruce says, "I'll get drive-through." And so, like, reasonably, like that, like whole entire scene, I think was just to be lined up for them to eventually edit that out of this movie to eventually be used in a McDonald's commercial at some point, from what I remember. So going into this, we have it to where Nicole is ultimately just having seemingly her way with Batman, and then ultimately Batman is just like, you know what, like all these women, you just like they're like I should just start beating them off with a stick at this point, and at some points he probably had to. So he ultimately runs off because Commissioner Gordon comes in, the again very ignorant Commissioner Gordon, that is ultimately just like, "Hey, what's going on?" And ultimately, Batman's like, "False alarm," and then he leaves. So we have it to where ultimately that Bruce Wayne ends up having um, to get in some of that sweet, delicious crime, and ultimately for yet another attempt of seemingly Two Face trying to get all up in his grill again and try to take him down. Numerous times as Two Face try to take this character down, and every time Batman ends up thwarting him at some point or another. All the while this is going on, we are having numerous seemingly attempts of Two Face leaving little calling cards for Bruce at his home, at his office, everywhere. Ultimately, we find out that that Bruce Wayne is getting a lot of clues from a very interesting source, to the point where eventually he has to go to Nicole Kidman's character to ultimately ask her about all these riddles, all these clues. And so eventually we have it to where Batman goes and is asking her about all these riddles, because ultimately he knows all the answers for all these riddles, but ultimately he's looking for Nicole Kidman's character as a consultant. The funny thing of this is when Bruce ends up knocking on the door of Nicole Kidman's uh 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 what would this be called? Her uh her therapy room, I guess we can call it. He ends up knocking down her door and then making his way in, thinking that she was being attacked, when ultimately she was kickboxing or boxing her way uh, just through some things. So ultimately, we have it to where Val and Kidman are ultimately having this scene together. ultimately to have Bruce noticing that Kidman has had a very much fascination with Batman to the point of having an entire table filled with images of Batman. And ultimately, he is trying to assess what she knows about Batman. So we have it to where Bruce ultimately is looking at some doll of sorts, and Kidman mentions that it's a kind of like a dream catcher to get him um, to have better dreams, and so ultimately he ultimately looks so sad, and of course Kidman ultimately mentions like, well, hey, do you need one, Bruce? Do you need one of those, Bruce? You want one of those? Because ultimately we have it to where bizarrely we have Kilmer that is consistently going through these dream sequences of him running through supposedly a graveyard with this red book from his father, which makes no sense. I don't really understand why this book has to matter. I don't understand, like, what was the point of this book? I the whole point of all of these flashbacks within this movie do not help in any form or fashion to justify why they need to be placed. Like, it doesn't seem like the Red Book comes into a factor in any portion of the rest of this movie. It's just bizarrely, like, I guess that this book was supposed to be something within this movie and it never really gets there, so I don't know. I didn't really get what the Red Book was, where Bruce had to desperately run around with it within this graveyard, and then ultimately it leads it to where eventually Bruce falls into this cave and is seemingly having a bat fly, a giant bat fly right in front of him, to where his wings are just floating over and over and over again. I'm just like, this makes no sense. So we ultimately have it to where Bruce is ultimately convinced that ultimately he needs to get Kidman's character out of those clothes. She's like, what? And he's like, yeah, I need to get you into a dress. You need to come with me to the circus. Because, yeah, it's circus time, baby. So, ultimately push them into them very much being into the circus and having a good time. And so ultimately, we have a tour, of course, as per usual. Two-Face is, of course, doing yet another scheme to ultimately very much trying to get another bomb be placed or ultimately get another just more money be stolen. And so eventually he plants a bomb within this circus tent, ultimately forcibly wanting Batman to reveal who he is. The only problem is that Bruce does get up and does say, Harvey, I'm Batman. But the only problem is that everybody's screaming that no one can hear him. Not even Nicole Kidman that is sitting right next to him and says, You're Batman? I gotta go tell everybody. I'm getting out of here. I'm gonna get out of here. I'm gonna tell everyone that Bruce Wayne is Batman. Oh my god, I found this out. Me. Oh man, I'm gonna tell everybody that this guy is Batman. So ultimately, we have to where that is the stupidest thing. That it's like Kilmer is shouting this out, and you would think at least somebody next to him would honestly have said, "Oh my God, you're Batman," but no one did. So ultimately, we have it to where we have the Flying Graysons that were ultimately going to perform right before this bomb had appeared upon this circus. And so ultimately, what ends up happening is the Flying Graysons end up magically deciding to take care of this bomb. This big, huge, fat, bald bomb. To them, is just like, we got this. So, what ends up happening is, like, they end up taking this bomb and they end up, like, putting it through the roof and ultimately leading it to where they can get this bomb to the outside and otherwise roll this bomb into the ocean, into the water, and then the bomb explodes and kills nobody. But the only problem is that Two-Face was ticked about them finding a way to get rid of this bomb. So because of the bitterness of that, Two-Face had decided to kill Grayson's parents. And so when Grayson had realized that he had deciphered the bomb and took care of the bomb, coming back to his family to realize that they had both been dead. So we have it to where now Chris O'Donnell is ultimately now going to be placed within Wayne Manor because he has nowhere else to go. And so recently there is a moment where there's a line here to me that doesn't quite make sense. And when hearing this line, I'm like, okay, was this Robin supposed to be a much younger character? Because this line doesn't make sense to me. So we have it to where Chris O'Donnell is coming to the Wayne Manor because he has really much of nowhere else to go. So he comes there because ultimately he's kind of exhausted. He's had a long day. And so ultimately he goes to the manor and ultimately like we have it to where they're mentioning that that Grayson has nowhere to go. And so ultimately once everybody leaves, Grayson ultimately watches them go, and he ultimately tells Bruce and Alfred, he's like, well, hey, yeah, now that they left, like, I'm gonna get out of here. I'm gonna get out of your hair. Like, I just wanted to say that I was gonna stay here until they left. Because ultimately I didn't want to deal with, like, foster care or charities coming to me and wanting to try to fund me. I'm like, wait a minute, what? I'm like, this guy looks like he's in, like, his, like, pretty much late 20s. Like, what is up with foster care and charities? I'm like, this guy is quite well old enough to very much go into, like, really very much not needing any kind of real substantial parental figure to watch over him, which I thought was really bizarre. So ultimately we have to where Bruce is just like, well, hey, you know what? I'm going to figure out how to get this kid to stay here. Because you know what? It seems like both me and him have had a mirror-ish like past. And so reasonably, he ultimately is trying to find some kind of equivalent to get him to stay. And so ultimately he mentions, Bruce mentions to Dick, it's like, well, hey, like, well, if anything, it's going to be a while before you can really gas up your hog. How about you and me, like, go into my garage and ultimately we'll gas that up for you and then you can go on your way. So Grayson ends up going with Bruce to ultimately check out Bruce's garage. And so ultimately we have it to where Grayson gives the line, it's like, this is a garage or a museum? So ultimately we have it to where Grayson is eventually looking through Bruce's motorcycle collection, and he's kind of like going, "Oh, hey, this is a Thunderbird, or this is this kind of motorcycle, and this is that, and this." And so ultimately, Bruce is like, "Well, hey, yeah, like, I guess, yeah, you really are a motorcycle guy. Hey, if anything, um, like Alfred like does his best, but he's not really much of a mechanic. If anything, if you were to fix up some of these motorcycles and some of these cars, if anything, you could probably keep some of them as a payment." So Grayson is kind of looking at this and he's like, you know what? Maybe I could want to stay here after all. Because reasonably, when looking at this, I'm going to retaper back to this moment once we get into uh, Batman and Robin, because ultimately, Alicia Silverstone in the sequel of this movie, like, we kind of harpen back onto this moment within that sequel with Alicia Silverstone and her just stealing a motorcycle and riding off into the night. So going into this, we have to where Bruce is just like, well, hey, I got this kid now. I got him. Like, I try to figure out a way how to kind of get him to stay here, and he did. Ha! We suckered him in, Alfred. High five! So, we have it to where ultimately we have these bizarrish moments that have no real importance of really showcasing how Grayson doesn't want Al to wait on him. Ultimately, having it to be where ultimately Grayson's character is going to do seemingly his own laundry and hang his stuff out to dry. We have it to the point of where Grace, the entire mansion, and I guess double checking to make sure every single mansion door is unlocked or locked. And so eventually it gets to the point to where Grayson goes to Al and he's like, "Hey, Al, why is it that this door is locked out of all the doors in all the mansion? Because I went through every single one, like expecting that at some point I was going to open one door and just the Booger Man was going to pop out." It's a little joke for me to add in here. But, like, why is it that this one door is locked? And so we ultimately find out in the most memorable line out of this whole entire movie is Alfred mentions, it's like, well, like, I'll tell you, this is that is the room of Master Wayne's dead wives. He has a whole entire room dedicated to the women that had died in this mansion. How many numerous women have just passed away in the Wayne Mansion, and so ultimately he has had a collection of bizarrish like women that are like, what are they, cremated? Are they all in there? Are they all, like, this makes no sense. And so ultimately, like, basically, like, Grayson has to buy into this because ultimately, like, justifiably, it's like, I would just be like, you know what? I think I'm out of here now. Now that I know that Bruce is a little bit of a freak, I am out of here. He doesn't naturally he doesn't naturally just put his loves in a graveyard like any normal common person. What did he like wax them? Did he like wax all the bodies? Just he stuffed them. That's what he did. That freak, that weirdo. You know what? If I would have heard that news, I'm like, dude, I am deucing. I am out of here. Like, I'm not gonna be like in the middle of the night being attacked by some Bruce Wayne ghost gal edge like person. I'm out of here. But ultimately, we have it to where stubbornly, we have to where Bruce is again having some Kidman time and ultimately finally relenting to her about his entire dreams for her to ultimately feel sad for him and ultimately for her to pity him and really start to fall for him because ultimately we have it to be that we're spending way too much time on these love interest like moments. So, all the while that this is also going on, we are also eventually getting Edward Nigma to get his outfit, to ultimately figure out who he's supposed to be, ultimately asking a very bizarrish 8-ball Ash like machine whether or not he should do what he does. And so, reasonably, he is ultimately asking a machine of sorts, like, about, hey, do you want to hear about my day? And ultimately, the machine points to, nah. So it gets to a point where eventually, when Edward Nigma is watching Two-Face ultimately going into killing everyone at the circus, and of course, trying very much well to end the Grayson Circus Act. Right after this, Edward Nigma is eventually trying to think like, well, hey, like I wanna be a villain. I think I'm smart enough because ultimately he had very much lost his job, or ultimately he had very much decided to otherwise terminate himself while also terminating his superior, ultimately changing the footage to ultimately look like his superior had jumped out of a window, but ultimately, really, what happened was that he had made him watch this 3D TV, and all while doing that was sucking out his intelligence, was sucking out his information, his social security and his credit card numbers and everything, all of his knowledge, making his IQ increase by proxy, and then eventually dumping him out a window once realizing, you know what, I'm just kind of done with you. Like, I finally perfected this experiment, and now I'm going to be able to use it on everybody. And so, yeah, we have it to where Edward is realizing how viable being a supervillain is, and so eventually he is trying to come up with ideas of what to use for a costume. And so at first we get through a couple different scenarios of what Jim Carrey's character could ultimately have been, Captain Kill or this and that. We have a kind of a barrage of different kind of very approaches to villainy, and every single time the machine that is also yes or knowing is ultimately going, nope. So eventually we get to the point to where ultimately Edward Nigma's character goes like, "How about Question Man?" And so ultimately, that's when the green light goes on to say, "Yeah, Question Man." So ultimately, Edward Nigma realizes that this machine had does this, and he's like, "Oh, hey, yeah, thank you, machine. Like, thank you so much." And ultimately, he puts out the entire schematic of figuring out how his costume is going to look, and then eventually makes his way to eventually meeting Two Face because ultimately he quickly assesses that the the bizarrish 3D box TV thing was a way for him to find him, with him plopping this device onto his head to seek out people's information. So ultimately, we have it to where Riddler and Enigma or Riddler and Two-Face are trying to decipher whether they should team up or not, and really comes down to a flip of the coin. And of course, wouldn't you think, it ends up going to the right journey of which to team these two characters up. So the funny point is when ultimately Riddler asks, like, hey, how exactly do you punch a guy? And so ultimately we have it ball at the fist, reach way far back, assert yourself, and punch. And so we have to where Tommy Lee Jones' character easily punches this guy in the face. And of course, when Riddler does it, since he is not a muscle-bound, edge-like guy of any sorts, he hurts his hand. So we have it to where these guys are having a heck of a time. They're kind of really going all nuts, going all crazy to establish that they really need to get as many resources as possible to be able to afford their new venture of making a massive company that otherwise is funded by crime, to ultimately make it so that these boxes that ultimately everyone can get within every store to get these 3D images, but they don't realize that their brainwaves are being transmitted elsewhere. So going into this, we have it to where Bruce is talking to that woman, that Kidman woman, and talking about his dream sequence, but then eventually he's getting interrupted by Alfred, ultimately on a watch. Ultimately letting Bruce know that, hey, just letting you know that Master Dick, yeah, he took the car, and ultimately, like, Bruce is like, okay, so he took a car, like the Jaguar, the Maserati, the which one? And like Alfred's like, the other car. And like Bruce is like, well, hey, this and this and that. It's like, no, the other car. So Bruce is like, you know what? I think I need to get out of here. I think I need to get out of here. I think the time of here is just about up. So we ultimately have it to where ultimately that Grayson took the Batmobile and is cruising for chicks. So ultimately he is, of course, just kind of taking the Batmobile and just kind of having fun with it. And so when eventually it seems that a bunch of women are all swarming the Batmobile, and ultimately Grayson pops the hood to ultimately showcase, hey, yeah, I'm Batman, and everybody's like, you ain't Batman, you ain't got the costume like Batman. So ultimately, on a side note, there's a bunch of gangsters who are all wearing these like neon esh like paints, and ultimately they had very much grabbed a woman and are trying to hold her to, I guess, hostage? I don't know. Like, just holding her for reasons that don't make sense to me. And so we have to where Grayson ends up hearing the sounds of a woman that desperately needs his help. So Grayson ends up running over there and starting to really take down a lot of these goons. And to the point where, like, he's taken down everybody. to the point to where ultimately we have it to where the girl is just like, well, you know what? I think everything's okay. I think I can leave. But ultimately, she asks, "It's like, well, doesn't the guy usually kiss the girl?" And so ultimately, uh, we have it to where Robin or Grayson lands a big old smooch on this girl, and she's like, "Okay, thanks, bye." And so he's like, "I could really get into this superhero gig." So we have it to where now the seemingly leader of this neon colored gang ultimately is now clapping his hands, ultimately calling for reinforcements, and that of course is to where we have it to where Grayson is now firing on or fighting from off of uh, a fire escape and trying very much to like try to knock down some of these goons, but it's getting a little difficult. And that's where we get Batman gliding his way in, and then everybody scatters because they're like, oh man, it's Batman now. It's actually Batman. So they all scatter, and so we have it to where Robin is ultimately just not even realizing what he's even doing, and he is punching Batman over and over, saying that it should have been him, it should have been should have been you, and ultimately he mentions that it's Batman's fault and that ultimately he like Two-Face should have been killed. And so Bruce ultimately, I mean Batman tries to comfort Grayson by mentioning it's like if Batman could have been able to save your parents, he would have. And so that gives him an inch of comfort to ultimately have us go back to where ultimately we have Bruce being seemingly like addressing his wounds, and so we ultimately have or no, wait, blah, blah, blah. That comes later. We ultimately have it to where we now have the moment to where ultimately Al is starting to really get to know Grayson at some points in this and that, and so ultimately we have it to where we find out that Grayson has a helmet with a robot on it, and so ultimately Al asks what the helmet is, and of course, um, Grayson mentions that it's a Robin because at some point he had saved his brother by jumping in out of nowhere to swoop in like a Robin. So eventually, Grayson gives his circus performance costume to Al and ultimately tells him to throw in the garbage. And ultimately Al won't do that, and he's like, I will just set this aside because broken wings will mend in time. And so ultimately kind of alluding that Robin will fly again. And so reasonably with ultimately with ultimately Grayson having this moment of not really realizing what he was doing and ultimately pressuring Bruce that wants to he wants to do this with him. He wants to go and kill Two-Face. And And then ultimately Bruce is telling him no. It's like, if anything, you have time. It's like you have time to still make a choice. And so ultimately you need to, you need time to heal from this. And like ultimately, because what will happen is, if if Grayson goes out there looking for blood, basically, yeah, he will get his vengeance. He will get his death. He will get his murder that he wants. But then when it ends up being that way, it'll just be like, okay, well, yeah, but maybe not exactly that person that I thought was the killer of my parents. Maybe it's actually this person. And so, eventually vengeance will turn into death, but death will turn into bloodlust, and to where it gets to the point to where Robin will just go on a killing spree and kill numerous people over and over and over again, because reasonably, Bruce uh is trying to tell Robin that he has a time to think about this, process it, and to move on, and try to, instead of going the direction of which Bruce went into, which ultimately he is mentoring Grayson to ultimately realize that once he becomes this superhero, he's never going to want to let this go. So, kind of telling him that it's like, yeah, this, after you cross that line, it's like, this is going to be the song that never ends, and you're going to go at this over and over and over again, for a broken record for the rest of your life, to the rest of your days, because ultimately you're just going to be so driven by the life that was snuffed out around you. So Grayson doesn't want to hear this, because again, he very much wants to put Two-Face at least behind bars or something. But so we have it to where now, with the Riddler and the Two-Face finally teaming up, and so now we have it to where Edward Nygma is really cementing his company, and now cementing how, basically his company is mainstream, making a ton of money, and so now we are pushed to having this being presented as some kind of quasi conventional thing, to where everybody's going into some room to see their fantasies come true into these rooms. So, and ultimately this these rooms are also to try to figure out who is Batman, because ultimately we have Riddler that is going to Two-Face, and ultimately saying, I'm going to solve the greatest riddle of all, who is Batman. And because ultimately, when of course Riddler and Two-Face first meet, ultimately Riddler goes through the whole process of kind of trying to understand Two-Face, and kind of breaking down the two sides of him, and kind of mentioning how things are so him and so him. So we go into this movie, and now we are pushed to ultimately have it be that it's much more so, more than just going, okay, we aren't much going to have much of a master plan for these villains. It's just going to consistently be that, bring in more henchmen, and ultimately, otherwise, like, it seems like these plans are starting to be more and more, much more smarter. So, ultimately, within this mission, we ultimately have it to where, of course, Two-Face ends up breaking into the place of the convention of where all the rich people are that are, of course, getting within these Enigma-like rooms to see their fantasies come to life. And so Nigma ultimately is very frustrated by Two-Face, how he is bashing his way through this environment. And so ultimately he's like, well, hey, like, we could have worked together on this. It's like we could have co-signed on the movie rights, or and like all of this stuff, like kind of breaking the fourth wall a little bit. But anyways, going into this movie, we have it to where eventually, of course, Bruce Wayne tries to shut the Enigma device, but when going into the room, we have Drew Barrymore turning it back on, and so ultimately Bruce ends up going through the machine, and we find out Bruce Wayne's deepest, darkest secrets. So the power ends up getting shut off after people are, of course, starting to battle and starting to fire off rounds. And so Bruce ends up being knocked out of uh, this this device, and then eventually he was running off to eventually get uh, to tell Alfred that it's an emergency and that ultimately he needs a change. All while Grayson was also with Bruce and eventually also calls the exact same thing, that it's an emergency, that ultimately he needs a change. So we have it to where Bruce ends up kind of going through this kind of uh, portion of which where Batman crashes through the very top of the building, and of course, Nigma has to mention to Two-Face, like, your entrance was good, his was better. What was the difference? Showmanship. So, we have Batman eventually for seemingly an actual good portion of time actually beating some henchmen, and that's eventually leading to where Two-Face is eventually trying to get Batman out of the building to ultimately go into this manhole cover, which also leads him down this underground like setup that they had been setting this up for him for a very long stretch of time, for him to fall into this sliding like apparatus, to fall into this room, to where ultimately he is going to be the shot with like fire to the point where he is supposed to be like melted or just really extremely hurt. The only problem is that this ultimately Batman tries to encase himself into his cape, to where ultimately nothing is going to work. To where he's basically shielded himself, and so reasonably within this scenario, we are very much having Batman sliding through this chute to be pushed into this seemingly room. To ultimately he is completely doused with fire, to where he completely seals himself in with said room with his flame retardant like cape. Ultimately, here's where Tommy Lee Jones assumes that, oh yeah, I took him, I got him, I killed him. And so, of course, Batman gets out basically unharmed, and ultimately, here's where we have the Tommy Lee Jones line, why can't you just die? And then eventually he shoots a rocket into said underground lair, and then leaves to just see eventually Batman crumble down in this rubble to eventually be rescued by Grayson, who comes at the very last minute to grab said Batman and pull him out of said uh, of said environment, and then basically goes, yeah, yeah. Like he doesn't have much to say for his first ever real Batman-ish like caper. And so we have it to where ultimately here is where we have Kilmer nursing his wounds, and ultimately we have it to where Chris O'Donnell's character is mentioning, it's like, hey, what should my name be? Nightwing, like, what should my name be? And ultimately we have it to where Bruce Wayne hits him with, how about Dick Grayson, college student? And ultimately I honestly think what should have happened is that ultimately Grayson should have come back with, it's like, well, hey, how about you change your name from Batman to Dead Parents? Because good God, have you been using that one liner or that one note for your entire existence? Like, how is it that he's going to get women to sleep with him? Mention his dead parents. How's how is everybody gonna not really care that it's Bruce Wayne flying around at night? Dead parents. It's like, yeah, the Waynes were so like such a prestigious family that we all just love. Dead Parents. We're gonna have to change Batman's name for the rest of this review to Dead Parents. So that's what it is. That's what it is now. So we ultimately have it to where, like, I like in like Batman and Robin, where ultimately like Grayson ultimately picks at Batman and ultimately says, "You can't stand it that she picked me instead of you. You just can't stand it." And I was like kind of expecting like this to have that same kind of sting where it's just like, it's like, well, like I'm gonna like he ultimately kind of very much goes into like, well, I'm gonna fight crime whether you like it or not, and like, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. And Bruce Wayne gets up and he's like, I'll stop you. It's like, whatever, Bruce. Al is helping him out. He's gonna get him a tailor here pretty soon. And so ultimately we have it to where push comes to shove, and ultimately we keep getting these clues that keep happening within this home. Ultimately, eventually, Kilmer is pushing to want to tell Kidman's character everything. Ultimately, telling that he is quitting being Batman, and ultimately he is turning off all of his gadgets, turning off all his bat boats and bat wings and stuff like that, and ultimately he's going to quit being Batman because he much rather would want a gal into his bedroom, because again, once Batman dies, he is again going to be reign supremely Dead Parents for now on. So he's going to change his name to Bruce Dead Parents. So, because that's the card that he deals, sadly enough, in this movie, much more so than I think ever before. Because there is some kind of allusions to him putting roses on Crime Alley, but like it's not as thoroughly and as thickly as it is in this movie, sadly enough. So we have it to where Kilmer is going to confess to Kidman about being Batman, and ultimately, of course, we have Grayson that is just like, no, you just can't quit. It's like, come on. It's like, ultimately, it's like, what about all the crime out there? What about all the villains? So ultimately, you also have these. We have these clues keep coming, and so ultimately we have it to where it's getting to the point of very much Bruce figuring out all these clues, and so eventually it gets down to the point of now we are to have trick or treat. So we ultimately have it to where Riddler and Two-Face figure out who Batman is because ultimately they have the videotape of Bruce Wayne's mind. What a freak! So ultimately they find out that Bruce has bats on the brain. So ultimately, in that vein, they go to his house and trick or treat. Ultimately bop Al on the head, and ultimately Dick is leaving because knowing full well that that Bruce is giving up the cape and cowl, Grayson is leaving because otherwise it's just what is the point of all this to just throw in the towel right now. So Bruce is home, just kind of ultimately just kind of getting with Kidman, ultimately seemingly getting to the point of almost telling her that he is Batman. It's kind of getting closer and closer to that moment, really revealing how he had seen a giant bat when he was younger in the cave, and ultimately that he's getting very, very close to telling Kidman that he's Batman. But instead, they very much end up being assaulted by Two-Face and his goons because ultimately Riddler is going through and completely annihilating the Batcave. Here's the thing. So, we've had Commissioner Gordon have absolutely no clue where Batman has been this entire time. So, let me get this straight. So, the Riddler, all he has to do is just get some information off of Bruce Wayne's mind and just be able to reconfigure his Riddler stick or Riddler cane to ultimately be some apparatus to open up doors. Because obviously, going into Bruce Wayne's mind, he knows where the Batcave is. And so the Riddler goes in and completely annihilates the Batcave, as well as Two-Face eventually annihilates, grabbing Bruce Wayne's gal from him, and then eventually just dropping Bruce down a flight of stairs. But ultimately, as Two-Face goes to kill him, Riddler stops him. So within this Batcave, we, because tapering back a little, I want to spend a little bit more time in here. There's a lot of funny moments, honestly, going into this Batcave. There are very few points in time within this movie that I feel like this entire movie feels like a sitcom or like a TV show, and the budget feels very minute to me. But when going into this scene, I thought that they took a lot of mileage out of this and had a lot of fun with it. To ultimately, when Riddler comes into the Batcave, immediately there is the intruder alert that ultimately goes to be very much uh, like being, of course, like when Grayson had gone to the Batcave, intruder alert. When, of course, Riddler goes in the Batcave, intruder alert. So here's my thing. We ultimately have it to where when Riddler comes in here, Grayson comes in here, intruder alert. But evidently uh, before we have like absolutely no intruder alert, and then eventually in Batman and Robin, when we have Alicia Silverstone going to the Batcave, intruder alert. But anything in between, like anything with the Keaton era, they don't have intruder alerts. So we have it to where Jim Carrey is throwing seemingly a baseball into the Batcave and trying as much as possible to annihilate all of Batman's gear, ultimately exploding the Batmobile, mentioning that the fat lady is on in 5, and so the Riddler throws the bomb into the Batcave, and then the Batmobile explodes. Basically, Jim wipes out all of the things and ultimately goes back into Two-Face, almost shooting Bruce, but ultimately he prevents him because it's like, he won't learn nothing. So, we ultimately have it to where this last clue is a tennis match. So, they end up running away with Batman's gal, and they end up coming with their grand Fajah scheme to ultimately have Riddler be wearing a jacket because it keeps him safe while jogging at night, and so or maybe it's a sweater. Do you like my sweater? Keeps me safe while I'm jogging at night. Anyways, we have it to where ultimately, and of course during that scene, we have that classic line where Kidman mentions like, Batman will come for me. It's like, Batman? Batman, use a name. Coming for you. I'm counting on it. So much scenery being eaten by Jim Carrey, it's ridiculous. But at the end of the day, that's just how Jim Carrey's delivering this character. So we have it to where in this movie that Bruce is now having to figure out every single one of these riddles and having to compile to figure out what they all mean together. And so we have it to where at first the first part of the clue is mystery, and then the second part of the clue is like, okay, it's like, well, what's another word for mystery? It's like an enigma, and it's like Mr. Enigma, Edward Nigma. And then ultimately we have to where Alfred is just like, you know what? Like, a lot of people don't think you're quite all that smart, but you know what? You proved them wrong right here. So we ultimately have it to where Batman is ultimately just looking around and he's like, hey, what do we got left to use? And Al's like, well, the only thing that we have really left is all the prototypes, but they haven't been used yet. And Bruce goes, it's like, well, tonight is probably going to be that night. So we have it to where Batman is thrusting upon all of his prototypes and hoping that everything goes well. And so we have it to where Grayson ends up coming back to ultimately let Bruce Wayne not have to figure out which vehicle to take to get to Riddler and Two-Face. Because ultimately, Bruce says, it's like, well, should I attack them by land or air or by sea? And ultimately, Robin goes, what about both? So we have it to where costume reveal of Robin being actually Robin with an R on his chest. And so ultimately we have it to where Bruce is like, well, what does the R stand for? It's like, Robin. It's like, who's your tailor? And Alfred's like, I took the liberty, sir. Because, like, ultimately, like, Alfred at some point is joking within this movie that at some point he's going to get fired. and that hopefully his some other job will take him back. And I thought that that's kind of hilarious to just see like Alfred just stubbornly going, yeah, you know what? I'm gonna make this guy a sidekick of Batman. Like, Batman's not gonna do it. Me, I'm the guy that's gonna put this whole thing together. So we have it to where within this movie that here's the kind of stupid part that ultimately that comes a little bit after this. So we have Robin that ultimately mentions is like, you know what? I'm not going to guarantee that I'm not going to want to try to kill Two Face, and ultimately like Bruce goes is like, well, like yeah, you kind of have to go your own way. You gotta have your own path. Uh, and and so ultimately it's like yeah, we start having these silly Esh like catchphrases kind of leading up to this one handshake like moment, which I think is ridiculous. And so ultimately we get to the point of like this kind of back and forth like moment to ultimately Grayson mentions like, yeah, I'm not going to guarantee that I'm not going to kill Two Face. Batman goes, it's like, well, um, like you're like, if anything, you're going to carve your own path. And then Grayson's like, well, yeah, but maybe I might need somebody to like fight alongside with as as a as a brother. And like Bruce Wayne's like, yeah, as a partner. And then they shake hands. That is such a stupid moment where like like they're fighting alongside one another as brothers. Yeah, as partners. It's like, God, there's so much about these lines that are so hammed up by Kilmer, which I think just kills a lot of these lines where you're laughing at them now because it seems so ingenuous, these deliveries. It seems so weird. And so we have to where Robin is peeling off to eventually do his boat thing, and then also we have Gordon, who is bizarrely shining a light on the bat signal for reasons that I don't quite understand. And Batman is flying through the air, of course, just like the very first uh, Batman-ish like movie. And here's the extremely, again, goofy part that makes no sense in this movie. So here's a silly part to where we have it to where uh, Gordon is like, you know what, shut it off. I don't think he's coming tonight. And so then we have like Batman with his Batwing just like lazily like flying, and then like Gordon is getting all jazzed. He's like, oh my god, wait, he's there. He's right there. Yes, go, go. And so Batman like turns to the side and he's like, I was laughing so freaking hard at this moment because I was like, why is he like he's like he had to like shift and then thumbs up and then he had to like shift back and then like and then fly the thing. Why this moment had to be like, why did he have to do that? Because knowing full well Gordon is not going to be seeing a thumbs up from hundreds of feet of distance, because Gordon doesn't have no binoculars of which I could see. I am so confused. That was so ridiculous how like Batman had to just like turn and just go and then shift back. Oh my god, that scene is so hilarious. So we have to where uh we have to where both Two Face and Riddler are doing Battleship. And so ultimately, they're doing Battleship, and they are very much killing two birds with one stone, because ultimately Two-Face is trying to figure out what bomb to set off that will explode Robin's Batboat. And ultimately, once that happens, ultimately Robin ejects, and ultimately we have it to where Riddler says, "Oh my God, you shrunk my battleship," and so ultimately he goes on a line and uh, plays a like a pilot from an airplane, and he ultimately like, excuse me, uh, airplane goers, we're going to be experiencing some turbulence. So eventually he hits the button to ultimately uh, there is a weaponized thing with this big, huge Riddler-esque like statue monument like thing that ultimately hits Batman to ultimately wreck his Batwing, to ultimately he ejects out of that. So we have both Grayson and Batman, who are both now on the rocky rocks below. And so ultimately, Robin is kind of looking and realizing that these rocks don't really feel like rocks. They're kind of hollow. And so ultimately, Batman is like, okay, I don't know what to make of that. And so ultimately, bizarrely, like, it seems that these sections of this rocky environment, all of a sudden, like, Batman's environment like goes into an accelerated height. And so Robin is just like, well, okay, I guess I'm just gonna like, see you later, Batman. So we ultimately have it to where Two-Face eventually jumps out to fight Robin. And again, here's, of course, another hilarious moment, because this is where the fun never ends. So ultimately, we have it to where like Robin is getting his licks in, and he is consistently, repetitiously punching Two-Face, and he is ultimately mentioning, it's like, yeah, I'm gonna get my vengeance moment. And so he ultimately is like, every time he punches, like, that's from my mother, my father, my brother, and this one's from me. Two for flinching. So we ultimately have it to where within this, that, like, of course, like, Grayson is getting too eager, and that leads to his downfall, and ultimately him wanting to arrest Two-Face instead of killing him right there, again gets Two-Face to get the upper hand, and so that eventually ends up leaving Robin to be tied up, to eventually be served upon this grand old this big old prize like game show at the end of this. So ultimately, it seems that uh, that we have Riddler, who is ultimately getting siphoned all this information through every number of people around Gotham. And so eventually we also get him to be siphoning off of information from Dr. Chase Meridian, which I finally remember the freaking name for once, and then also Grayson. So we have it to where Bruce eventually goes through seemingly this this underground watery like grave, to where ultimately he eventually has this ceiling seemingly coming down on him. But recently, Batman is quickly able to get through this apparatus simply by just like putting rockets onto his boots to break the equilibrium of this seemingly thing that is trying to get him from the very top of said uh, environment to get to Riddler and to Two Face. So after the equilibrium of this thing that is trying to get him down to this watery grave, ultimately Batman eventually shoots himself all the way up to pop out of where ultimately the Riddler is. So ultimately, the Riddler is now going to present Batman with the big old grand finale, the lightning round of sorts, and so ultimately he is wanting Batman to choose between the Bruce's love or the Dark Knight's junior partner. Ultimately mentioning like little interesting things about each one another, to where um, I think Robin stuff is more interesting, where it's like where Grayson's favorite things are Saturday morning cartoons, and ultimately dreams to one day become bare naked with a girl. Ooh. So we have it to where ultimately Riddler is wanting Batman to choose between Bruce's love or the Dark Knight's junior partner, and so ultimately Batman is deciding, you know what, like this is one big giant death trap, and whatever choice that I make doesn't matter. And so Riddler goes, I'm sorry, but you were supposed to answer that in the form of a question. So we have it to where Batman tells Riddler, well, hey, I have a riddle for you. And ultimately, Riddler is pleased about this, and he's like, really? Like, tell me. So we have it to where Batman, all the while telling Riddler this riddle, he is getting ready with all of his equipment. He's like changing his lights. He's changing his eyes to be a different kind of schematic. He's changing his equipment to fall into his hands. He's hitting buttons and this and that, and so ultimately he sees without seeing. To me, darkness is as blinding as daylight, and this and that, and so it gets to the point where he asks Riddler, it's like what am I? And he of course says, "Please, you're blind as a bat." And of course, that's when Batman says, "Exactly." And so he takes his batarang and throws it into this chandelier esh like thing that is being on the top of Riddler's seemingly little home section, and this seemingly chandelier esh like thing is holding all the knowledge up to be saved for Riddler to eventually then cipher off again. But since this chandelier esh like apparatus thing had been broken, the barrier between the knowledge and Riddler is now like he's getting all the knowledge and he can't stop it. And so now he's getting an over surplus of information and he can't control it all. And so he's basically like, yeah, bummer. And so eventually he hits his two devices to just unleash uh, both of the contraptions to unlock both Bruce's love and the Dark Knight's junior partner. So it ends up, of course, being to where we have it to where Batman ultimately dives for his love at first, and of course hooks her to safety, but then eventually he dives even further along to eventually reach out for Robin. And so of course we have it to the very near nick of time to ultimately Bruce shoots out his another kind of battling gun or whatever to ultimately try and get Robin, and he just gets barely gets Robin by the rope, the hand ropes, and so ultimately Robin is looking at Bruce and ultimately saying, "Ah, thanks." And so ultimately he's like grabbing at Bruce's hand. And he's like, "Yeah, I saved you. Yeah, I got you at the near nick of time, but hey, I did it, buddy." So both of them end up going into very much like now like being trying to get out of here and try to figure out a way out. And so ultimately now Two-Face is again thinking of his next plan to try to attack both Robin and Batman. And so ultimately, like, this is where Tommy Lee Jones is ultimately just like, well, hey, now, like, you know what? Like, we're not going to have doors 1 and 2. We're not going to have any kind of mysterious object behind a curtain. It's just plain curtains. And so ultimately, Batman is like, well, hey, like, before you decide to kill us, like, isn't it exactly you need to have a decision to be able to do that or not? And so, of course, that's when Two-Face is like, well, you know what? Like, you know what, Bruce? Like, you're always really smart. I always admired you, and like, you're always a great friend to me. Thank you. And so ultimately, Two-Face flicks the coin, and so ultimately, Batman also flips a batch of coins up in the air as well, to where Two-Face is crazily grabbing all of the coins to push him off this ledge to then kill him, to where at the very end of this, he grabs the coin when he is drowning in his death after his fall. And Robin is like looking down and he's like, yeah, yeah, we did it. Yeah. And so we have to where they are going back to fly up to then talk to the Riddler, because ultimately Batman has to mention to Riddler that it's like, well, hey, like, just letting you know that, like, I no longer have to choose between being Batman or being Bruce Wayne, because I can be both. And has this very long-winded speech kind of mentioning that. And all the while he's mentioning all this, the entire time we are having it to where Ipkiss is eventually, or Ipkiss, why am I saying Stanley Ipkiss? That's The Mask. That's the other Jim Carrey character. Jim Carrey is very much like, why can't I kill you? Too many questions. So, and then to the point where eventually when Bruce finishes this whole skit about that he does that he can be Bruce Wayne and Batman, not because he wants, or not that he needs to be, is that he wants to be, and this and that. And so, all while Jim Carrey's wrapping up this whole thing by freaking out, by him hallucinating about the giant bat that ultimately had been in Bruce's mind. And so ultimately he's freaking out about that. So later on, we have it to where in this Arkham Asylum, ultimately we have Nicole Kidman that is going back into the asylum to ask uh, Edward Nygma, like, hey, like, you've been screaming for hours, who is Batman, as if you know. Well, tell me, who is Batman? And so ultimately we have it to where Nygma says, it's like, well, I'll tell you if you say please. And so, of course, Nicole Kidman says, like, will you please tell me who is Batman? And of course, that's like the first time that I ever saw this ending of this movie, where ultimately Jim Carrey is like is in the darkness and then pops out of the room. That gave me a jump. The very first time I ever saw this movie, when he jumps out of the darkness and says, "I'm Batman," and then he goes, and then he absurdly laughs, and to where ultimately he goes to she goes to Bruce and tells Bruce that it's like, well, yeah, like, he is completely insane, and ultimately your secret will be saved. So ultimately we have it to where, like, that is just truly where the movie just really just ends, and that's how it all goes out. So without a doubt, I'm gonna get out of here because at the end of the day, I don't remember how long this Batman movie was, but I'm probably stretching on a very long time with this review. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.